The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Hartwell began his usual rounds. He had been a palace guard for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never seen anything that prepared him for what he would discover that Tuesday morning in October. Thomas walked quietly through the East Wing, his polished boots making soft echoes on the marble floors. The palace felt different since Queen Elizabeth had passed away just over a year ago. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that the very walls were still mourning their beloved monarch. The new King Charles had moved many of the Queen's personal belongings to a special memorial room, but some items remained exactly where she had left them. As Thomas approached the Queen's former private study, he noticed something unusual. The heavy oak door, which was always kept locked, stood slightly open. A thin beam of morning light escaped through the gap, creating a golden line on the dark wooden floor. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. This room was supposed to be sealed until the royal family decided what to do with the Queen's remaining personal effects. He moved closer to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio on his belt. Protocol demanded that he report any security breach immediately, but something made him pause. Through the crack in the door, he could hear a soft sound, almost like someone crying or whispering. Thomas had been trained to handle many situations, but this felt different. This felt personal and deeply emotional. Thomas carefully pushed the door open just enough to see inside. The room looked exactly as the Queen had left it. Her reading glasses still sat on the mahogany desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Fresh flowers, replaced weekly by the staff as a mark of respect, filled a crystal vase near the window. The morning light illuminated floating dust particles, making the air seem magical and sacred. But what Thomas saw next made him freeze completely. There, kneeling on the Persian carpet in the center of the room, was Queen Camilla. She was dressed in a simple black dress, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. In her hands, she held something that made Thomas's blood run cold. It was the ceremonial blade that had been used in Queen Elizabeth's coronation ceremony over 70 years ago. The blade was an ancient piece, passed down through generations of British royalty. It was made of the finest steel, with intricate engravings along its surface that told the story of the monarchy. The handle was decorated with precious stones that caught the morning light and scattered tiny rainbows across the walls. This was not just any sword. This was a symbol of royal power, of divine right, of the very foundation of the British crown. Thomas watched in stunned silence as Camilla held the blade with both hands, her fingers tracing the ancient engravings. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was speaking in a voice so quiet that Thomas could barely hear her words. She seemed to be having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, perhaps with the spirit of the late Queen herself. The guard had seen many private moments during his years at the palace. He had learned to look away when royals needed their privacy, to pretend he hadn't heard personal phone calls or witnessed family arguments. But this was different. This scene felt dangerous and unpredictable. Camilla's behavior seemed almost desperate, and the fact that she was holding such a significant and potentially dangerous object made Thomas extremely nervous. As he watched, Camilla lifted the blade higher, holding it above her head as if she were performing some kind of ritual. The morning light caught the steel, making it shine like silver fire. Thomas could see that her hands were shaking. Whether from emotion or the weight of the blade, he couldn't tell. Her lips were moving constantly, forming words that seemed to pour out of her like a prayer or a confession. Thomas knew he had to make a decision quickly. Every minute he waited increased the risk of the situation becoming more dangerous. But he also understood that whatever was happening in that room was deeply personal and emotional for the Queen consort. Camilla had faced many challenges since marrying Charles, and the death of Queen Elizabeth had created new pressures and expectations for her role in the royal family. The guard thought about all the rumors and whispers he had heard among the palace staff over the past year. Some said that Camilla struggled with feelings of inadequacy, that she felt she could never fill the shoes of the beloved Queen Elizabeth. Others whispered that she had been acting strangely lately, spending long hours alone in different parts of the palace, sometimes talking to herself. Thomas had always tried to stay out of palace gossip, but now those whispers seemed more significant. As he watched Camilla continue her mysterious ritual with the coronation blade, he wondered if this was a sign of something much deeper and more troubling than anyone had realized. The morning light grew stronger, and Thomas knew that other staff members would soon begin their duties in this part of the palace. The risk of someone else discovering this scene was increasing with every passing moment. He had to act, but he wasn't sure what the right action would be. Should he announce his presence and try to calm Camilla down? Should he immediately call for help? Or should he quietly retreat and pretend he had never seen anything? As these thoughts raced through his mind, Camilla suddenly stopped speaking and became completely still. The silence in the room was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Then slowly, Camilla began to lower the blade, bringing it down until it rested across her lap. She sat there in the morning light, holding the symbol of royal power, looking like a figure from an ancient painting or a scene from a tragic play. Thomas realized that whatever was about to happen next would change everything. This moment would become a turning point not just for Camilla, but potentially for the entire royal family. He took a deep breath and prepared to step into the room, knowing that his next actions would determine how this dramatic and mysterious scene would unfold. Thomas took a careful step into the room, his training telling him to announce his presence while his instincts warned him to be extremely gentle. The floorboard beneath his foot made a soft creak and Camilla's head snapped up immediately. Her eyes, red from crying, met his with a look of complete shock and fear. "Your Majesty," Thomas said softly, keeping his voice as calm and respectful as possible. "I was doing my morning security check and noticed the door was open. Are you all right?" Camilla stared at him for what felt like an eternity, her grip tightening on the ceremonial blade. Thomas could see the panic in her eyes, the way her breathing had become quick and shallow. She looked like someone who had been caught doing something forbidden, but also like someone who was lost and desperately needed help. I was just," Camilla began, then stopped. Her voice was hoarse, as if she had been crying or speaking for hours. She looked down at the blade in her hands, seeming surprised to find it there. "I don't know how to explain this, Thomas. I don't think anyone would understand." Thomas had been trained in crisis management, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He was facing the Queen Consort of England, holding a priceless royal artifact in what appeared to be some kind of emotional breakdown. Every word he spoke from this point forward could have enormous consequences for everyone involved. "Perhaps you could help me understand." "Your Majesty," Thomas said, taking another small step into the room but keeping a respectful distance. "Sometimes talking about difficult feelings can help us make sense of them." Camilla let out a bitter laugh that echoed strangely in the quiet room. "Difficult feelings? Thomas, I've been living with difficult feelings for 20 years. But this is something else entirely." She lifted the blade slightly and Thomas tensed, ready to act if necessary. But Camilla's movements remained controlled, almost reverent. "Every night since Elizabeth died, I've been having the same dream," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger. "I see her standing in this room, holding this very blade, and she's trying to tell me something. But I can never hear her words clearly. Last night, the dream was so vivid that I woke up believing she was actually here, calling to me." Thomas listened carefully, trying to assess whether Camilla was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis or if this was grief, manifesting in an unusual but understandable way. The death of Queen Elizabeth had affected everyone in the palace, but for Camilla, the loss represented something much more complex than simple mourning. "I came here this morning because I felt compelled to," Camilla explained, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "I found myself standing at this door before I even realized I had left my own quarters. When I touched the handle, the door opened as if it had been waiting for me. And then I saw this blade sitting on the desk where it had never been before." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He knew for certain that the Coronation blade was normally kept in the Tower of London, with the other crown jewels. How it had ended up in the Queen's private study was a mystery that would need to be solved quickly. But right now his priority was ensuring Camilla's safety and preventing the situation from escalating. "Your Majesty, that blade is very old and very sharp," Thomas said carefully. "Perhaps it would be better if we secured it properly while we figure out how it came to be here." Camilla looked down at the weapon in her hands, and for the first time, she seemed to truly see it. Her face went pale as she realized what she was holding. "Oh my God," she whispered. "How long have I been sitting here? What time is it?" Thomas checked his watch, surprised to see that it was already past 9 in the morning. If Camilla had been here since before dawn, she had been alone with the blade for several hours. The thought of what could have happened during that time made him deeply uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, it's Tuesday morning just after 9 o'clock. Thomas said. "Do you remember coming here? Do you remember how you got the blade?" Camilla's face showed genuine confusion and growing alarm. "I remember having the dream, and I remember feeling like Elizabeth was calling me. But everything after that is foggy. It's like I was sleepwalking, but I was awake." She looked at her hands, still gripping the ornate handle. "Thomas, I need you to help me. Something is very wrong, and I don't understand what's happening to me." The vulnerability in her voice touched Thomas deeply, despite all the protocol and formality that usually surrounded interactions with the royal family. In this moment, Camilla was simply a frightened woman who needed help. Thomas made a decision that would go against his training but felt right in his heart. "Your Majesty, I'm going to help you, but we need to work together," he said, moving slightly closer. "First, let's safely put down the blade. Then we need to figure out how to handle this situation in a way that protects you and the family." Camilla nodded gratefully, but as she began to lower the blade, something unexpected happened. The weapon seemed to catch the morning light in a new way, and for just a moment both Thomas and Camilla could swear they saw a reflection that wasn't their own. It was the unmistakable silhouette of Queen Elizabeth standing behind them in the room. Both of them spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for the two of them, and the memories that seemed to linger in every corner. When they turned back to each other, their eyes met with shared understanding. Whatever was happening here was beyond normal explanation. "Did you see that?" Camilla whispered, her voice filled with awe rather than fear. "I saw something," Thomas admitted, his own voice shaking slightly. "Your Majesty, I think we're dealing with something much bigger than we initially realized." As if responding to their words, a cool breeze suddenly moved through the room, despite all the windows being closed. Papers on the Queen's desk rustled gently, and the fresh flowers in the crystal vase seemed to turn slightly toward where they were standing. The very air in the room felt charged with an energy that neither of them could explain, but both of them could feel. Camilla stood up slowly, still holding the blade, but now her posture had changed. Instead of looking confused and frightened, she looked determined and almost regal. "Thomas," she said, her voice now strong and clear, "I think Elizabeth has been trying to tell me something important, and I think this blade is the key to understanding her message." Before Thomas could respond to Camilla's revelation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Multiple people were approaching, and their pace suggested urgency. Thomas recognized the heavy, measured steps of Chief Security Officer Margaret Walsh, accompanied by what sounded like at least 2 other guards. "Your Majesty, someone is coming," Thomas whispered urgently. "We need to decide right now how to handle this situation." Camilla's eyes darted between Thomas and the door, her newfound determination wavering as reality crashed back into the mystical moment they had just shared. The blade in her hand suddenly felt heavy again. Not like a divine message, but like evidence of something that would be impossible to explain to anyone else. "Thomas, they cannot see me like this," Camilla said, panic creeping back into her voice. "If word gets out that I was found holding the coronation blade in Elizabeth's room, acting strangely, the press will destroy me. They'll say I've lost my mind, that I'm not fit to be queen consort." The footsteps were getting closer, and Thomas could hear Margaret's voice giving instructions to the other guards. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the group reached the door. Thomas made a quick decision that would either save the situation or get him fired from his position. "Your Majesty, trust me," he said, stepping forward and gently taking the blade from Camilla's hands. The moment his fingers touched the ornate handle, he felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the weapon carried some kind of electrical charge, but there was no time to dwell on that mystery. Thomas quickly moved to the Queen's desk and carefully placed the blade in the large drawer where Elizabeth used to keep her personal correspondence. He closed the drawer just as Margaret's voice became clearly audible from right outside the door. "Camilla, sit in Elizabeth's chair and pretend you're reading something," Thomas instructed quietly. "I'll tell them I found you here paying your respects, looking through her personal papers." "It's believable and touching." Camilla quickly moved to the chair behind the desk, grabbing a letter from the scattered papers and holding it as if she had been reading it. Thomas positioned himself near the door, ready to explain the situation to his colleagues. Margaret Walsh appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. She was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded instant respect. Behind her stood two younger guards, both looking alert and slightly confused about why they had been summoned. "Thomas, what's the situation here?" Margaret asked, her tone professional but concerned. "We received a report that someone had accessed the Queen's private study without authorization." Thomas felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "Chief Walsh, I discovered Her Majesty Queen Camilla in the study during my morning rounds. She was paying her respects to the late Queen, looking through some personal papers. The door was unlocked when I arrived." Margaret's eyes moved from Thomas to Camilla, who looked up from the letter in her hands with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Camilla's earlier tears and distress actually helped sell the story, making her appear like someone who had been moved to visit this sacred space out of grief and respect. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, softening her tone slightly as she addressed Camilla, "I apologize for the intrusion. We weren't aware that you had planned to visit this room this morning. For security purposes, we usually like to be notified when members of the royal family wish to access restricted areas." Camilla stood up gracefully, still holding the letter. Thomas noticed that her hands were no longer shaking, and she had somehow managed to compose herself completely. "Of course, Margaret. I should have informed you. I couldn't sleep last night, and I felt drawn to come here this morning. Sometimes I feel Elizabeth's presence most strongly in this room." Margaret nodded, understanding. "That's completely understandable, Your Majesty. Many people find comfort in visiting places that held special meaning for their loved ones. Would you like us to arrange for regular access to this room if it helps with your grief process?" "That's very kind," Camilla replied, placing the letter back on the desk. "I think I've spent enough time here for today. Thomas has been very respectful of my need for privacy while ensuring my safety." Thomas felt a wave of relief as it seemed the crisis was being diffused successfully. But then Margaret took a step further into the room, her trained eye continuing to scan for anything unusual. Thomas held his breath, hoping she wouldn't notice anything out of place. "Your Majesty, if you don't mind me asking, how did you gain access to the room?" Margaret inquired. "The door is usually kept locked, and we maintain strict control over the keys." This was the question Thomas had been dreading. If Camilla couldn't provide a convincing answer, their carefully constructed explanation would fall apart. He watched her face, hoping she could think of something believable. Camilla paused for just a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, ornate key. "Elizabeth gave me this key years ago," she said quietly. "She told me that someday I might need to come here to this room to understand something important about being queen. I never used it while she was alive, but last night I felt compelled to remember where I had put it." Thomas stared at the key in amazement. He had never seen Camilla with it before, and he couldn't understand how she had managed to produce it so smoothly. Margaret examined the key from a distance and nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. "Of course," Margaret said. "Queen Elizabeth was always very thoughtful about preparing people for their future responsibilities. I'm sure she wanted you to feel comfortable accessing her private spaces when you needed to." As the group prepared to leave the room, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, on the surface of the desk where he had placed the blade in the drawer, was a faint outline in the dust. The shape was unmistakably that of the ceremonial weapon, as if it had been lying there for years rather than hidden away just moments ago. Margaret was walking toward the door, but Thomas feared she might turn around and notice the telltale mark. He quickly stepped forward and casually leaned against the desk, using his body to block the view of the outline. "Chief Walsh," he said, "should I escort Her Majesty back to her quarters, or would you prefer to handle that personally?" Margaret turned back toward them, and Thomas saw her eyes flick briefly toward the desk area where he was standing. For a moment he thought she might have seen something suspicious, but then she simply nodded. "I think Her Majesty is perfectly capable of finding her own way back," Margaret said with a slight smile. "Thomas, please continue with your regular rounds. And Your Majesty, please don't hesitate to contact security if you need access to any other areas of the palace." As the security team prepared to leave, Camilla moved closer to Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "We need to talk more about what happened here, but not now. Not here." Thomas nodded slightly, understanding that their strange encounter was far from over. As he watched Camilla walk gracefully out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just experienced something that would change both of their lives forever. That evening, as Thomas finished his shift, he found a small envelope slipped under his locker door. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant script that he recognized as Queen Camilla's handwriting. The message was brief but urgent. Garden Pavilion, 11 p.m. Come alone. We must discuss what cannot be spoken of elsewhere. See, Thomas spent the rest of the evening wrestling with conflicting emotions. His rational mind told him that getting involved in royal family mysteries was dangerous for someone in his position. But the memory of what he had witnessed that morning, the strange energy in the room, and the genuine fear and confusion in Camilla's eyes made it impossible for him to simply walk away. At exactly 11 o'clock, Thomas made his way through the palace gardens toward the small pavilion that sat beside the ornamental pond. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the carefully manicured lawns and creating long shadows between the ancient oak trees. The pavilion was a delicate structure built in the Victorian era, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows that glowed softly in the moonlight. Camilla was already there, sitting on one of the curved benches inside the pavilion. She had changed from her formal day wear into a simple dark coat and had pulled her hair back into a loose bun. In the moonlight, she looked younger and more vulnerable than Thomas had ever seen her during official functions. "Thank you for coming," she said as Thomas approached. "I wasn't sure if you would. What we experienced this morning, it's not the kind of thing one can easily discuss with a palace counselor or a doctor." Thomas sat down on the bench across from her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to speak quietly. "Your Majesty, I've been thinking about what happened all day. I need to ask you some direct questions, and I hope you'll trust me enough to answer them honestly." Camilla nodded. "After what you did for me this morning, after how you protected me when you could have easily reported the situation and let others handle it, I think I owe you complete honesty. The key you showed Margaret," Thomas began carefully. "Had you really had it for years, or did it just appear when you needed it?" Camilla was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the moonlit pond. "I had never seen that key before in my life," she admitted finally. "When Margaret asked about it, I reached into my pocket without thinking, and it was simply there. Just like the blade was simply there on Elizabeth's desk, even though we both know it should have been in the Tower of London." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that Camilla was being honest with him, but concern about what her answer implied. "Your Majesty, have you experienced anything like this before? Strange coincidences, objects appearing where they shouldn't be, dreams that feel too real?" "Not until Elizabeth died," Camilla replied. "But since then, yes, there have been other incidents. Small things mostly. I'll be looking for something and it will appear exactly where I need it to be. I'll have conversations with people, and later they'll tell me they never said the things I remember them saying. And the dreams. The dreams have been getting stronger and more frequent." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What exactly does Queen Elizabeth say to you in these dreams?" "That's just it," Camilla said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can never quite make out her words. It's like she's speaking through water or from a great distance. But the feeling is always the same. She's trying to warn me about something, or prepare me for something, and she keeps pointing to things, objects that have historical significance." A cool breeze moved through the pavilion, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Thomas found himself thinking about the moment that morning, when they had both seen Queen Elizabeth's reflection in the blade. Whatever was happening to Camilla, he was somehow becoming part of it. "Your Majesty, I need to tell you something," Thomas said. "When I touched that blade this morning, I felt something, like an electrical current, but more than that. It was as if the weapon was alive somehow, and when we both saw the reflection, I knew we were dealing with something beyond normal experience." Camilla's eyes widened. "You felt it too?" "Thomas, what if Elizabeth is actually trying to communicate with us? What if her spirit is somehow connected to these historical objects?" Before Thomas could respond, they both heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to the pavilion. Someone was approaching, walking slowly but deliberately. Thomas tensed, ready to protect Camilla if necessary, but also worried about how it would look if they were discovered having a secret meeting. "Stay calm," Camilla whispered. "If it's security, we're just having a conversation about tomorrow's schedule." But the figure that emerged from the shadows was not a security guard. It was King Charles himself, dressed in a casual jacket and walking with the slightly stiff gait that came from years of formal posture. His face was serious, and Thomas could see that he was troubled about something. "Camilla," Charles said as he approached the pavilion, "I've been looking for you. We need to talk." Thomas immediately stood up, unsure of the proper protocol for this situation. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Charles with a slight bow. Charles looked at Thomas with curiosity rather than anger. "Thomas Hartwell, isn't it? You've been with us for quite some time. I hope you'll forgive me for interrupting what appears to be a private conversation." "Actually, Charles," Camilla said, standing up as well, "Thomas was just the person I was hoping you might meet. He's become aware of some unusual circumstances that I think you need to know about." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Unusual circumstances? That sounds rather ominous. Perhaps we should sit down and discuss this properly." As the three of them settled onto the pavilion benches, Thomas felt the weight of the moment. He was about to become involved in royal family matters at a level that no palace guard had ever experienced. But he also sensed that whatever was happening was too important to worry about protocol or career concerns. "Charles," Camilla began, "I need to tell you about some experiences I've been having since your mother died. And Thomas has witnessed some of these experiences, so he can confirm that I'm not imagining things." Charles leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "What kind of experiences?" Camilla took a deep breath and began to tell her husband about the dreams, the mysterious appearances of historical objects, and the growing sense that Queen Elizabeth was trying to communicate with her from beyond death. As she spoke, Thomas watched Charles's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. To Thomas's surprise, Charles didn't look skeptical or concerned about his wife's mental health. Instead, he looked like someone who was finally hearing an explanation for something he had already suspected. "Camilla," Charles said quietly when she finished her account, "I haven't wanted to worry you, but I've been experiencing some unusual things as well. Not dreams, but feelings. Sensations that my mother is still present in the palace, still watching over us. And yesterday I found something in my private office that shouldn't have been there." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Even in the moonlight, Thomas could see that it was very old and obviously valuable. "This is my mother's private diary from the year she was crowned," Charles explained. "She kept it locked in a safe that only she knew the combination to. But yesterday I found it sitting open on my desk. Turned to a specific page, a page where she wrote about her fears and doubts about being worthy of the crown." Camilla reached out and took her husband's hand. "Charles, what if she's trying to help us? What if she's trying to prepare us for something that's coming?" Charles looked at both of them, his expression mixing wonder with concern. "Then we need to understand what she's trying to tell us. And we need to be very careful about who else learns about this." The next morning brought unexpected developments that would test the fragile trust between Charles, Camilla, and Thomas. As Thomas arrived for his shift, he found the palace buzzing with unusual activity. Additional security personnel had been called in, and there were rumors spreading among the staff about strange incidents throughout the building during the night. Thomas was approached immediately by Chief Security Officer Margaret Walsh, who looked tired and stressed. "Thomas, I need to speak with you privately about yesterday's incident in the Queen's study," she said, leading him to a small office away from the main corridors. Once they were alone, Margaret's professional demeanor became more serious. "Thomas, I've been reviewing the security footage from yesterday morning, and there are some inconsistencies that I need you to help me understand." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had hoped that their careful story about Camilla's private visit would be accepted without further investigation. "What kind of inconsistencies, Chief?" Margaret pulled out a tablet and showed Thomas a series of security camera screenshots. "According to our records, Queen Camilla was in her private quarters until 8:30 a.m. yesterday. But you reported finding her in Queen Elizabeth's study at 7:45 a.m. The cameras show her leaving her quarters at 8:32 a.m., which is after your reported discovery." Thomas stared at the images, trying to understand what they meant. The timestamps clearly showed Camilla in her nightgown in her own quarters at the exact time he had found her kneeling in Elizabeth's study with the ceremonial blade. It was impossible, but the evidence was right there in front of him. "Thomas, I need you to think very carefully about what you actually saw yesterday morning," Margaret continued. "Is it possible that you were mistaken about the time or about who you saw in that room?" Before Thomas could answer, his radio crackled with an urgent message. "All security personnel to the throne room immediately. We have a situation." Margaret and Thomas hurried through the palace corridors toward the throne room. joining a growing crowd of staff members and security guards. When they arrived, they found King Charles standing in front of the ornate throne, staring at something that made everyone in the room fall silent. There, placed carefully on the seat of the throne, was the ceremonial blade that Thomas had hidden in Queen Elizabeth's desk drawer the day before. But this time it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were other items from the crown jewels collection: the imperial state crown, the scepter with the cross, and the orb. All of these priceless artifacts should have been secure in the Tower of London, protected by multiple layers of security and electronic surveillance. "How is this possible?" Margaret whispered, echoing the thoughts of everyone in the room. Charles turned to address the gathered crowd, his face pale but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are clearly dealing with a security breach of unprecedented magnitude. I want every entrance to the palace searched, every staff member accounted for, and immediate contact with the Tower of London to confirm the status of the crown jewels." As the room erupted into organized chaos with security teams receiving their assignments, Thomas noticed that Camilla had entered from a side door. She moved quietly to stand beside her husband, but Thomas could see the shock and confusion on her face. Whatever was happening, she was as surprised by this development as everyone else. Over the next several hours, the investigation revealed facts that defied logical explanation. The crown jewels at the Tower of London were confirmed to be secure and undisturbed in their display cases. Yet identical artifacts sat on the palace throne, and expert examination confirmed that they were not replicas. They were genuine ancient items with the correct weight, materials, and historical wear patterns. Thomas found himself questioned multiple times about his discovery of Camilla in Queen Elizabeth's study. Each time he stuck to the agreed-upon story, but the security camera evidence made his account increasingly difficult to believe. Finally, Margaret approached him with a different kind of question. "Thomas, in your 15 years here, have you ever experienced anything unusual? Anything that you couldn't quite explain through normal means?" Thomas hesitated, thinking about the strange tingling he had felt when touching the ceremonial blade, and the unmistakable vision of Queen Elizabeth's reflection that both he and Camilla had witnessed. "Chief, are you asking if I believe in supernatural phenomena?" "I'm asking if you think there might be forces at work here that go beyond conventional security threats," Margaret replied. "Because frankly, what we're dealing with is starting to look less like a criminal act and more like something else entirely." Before Thomas could answer, one of the junior guards approached them with urgent news. "Chief Walsh, we've discovered something in Queen Elizabeth's private study. You need to see this immediately." The group hurried back to the study where Thomas had first found Camilla. Inside, they discovered that the room had been transformed overnight. Every surface was covered with historical documents, photographs, and artifacts that had previously been stored in various locations throughout the palace. The papers seemed to be arranged in a specific pattern, as if someone had been conducting research or trying to solve a puzzle. At the center of it all was Queen Elizabeth's personal diary, open to a page that none of them had seen before. In the late Queen's handwriting were words that made everyone in the room stop breathing. "The day will come when the crown must be defended not by armies or laws, but by those who understand that duty transcends death itself. The artifacts of power will call to their rightful guardians when the kingdom faces its greatest test. Trust in what cannot be explained, for love and loyalty are stronger than the boundaries between worlds." Margaret read the passage aloud, her voice growing quieter with each word. When she finished, the room was completely silent except for the sound of their own breathing. "This page wasn't here yesterday," Charles said finally. "I've read through Mother's diaries many times since her death, and I would have remembered these words." Thomas looked at Camilla and saw that she was staring at the diary with recognition in her eyes. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "is this what Queen Elizabeth was trying to tell you in your dreams?" Camilla nodded slowly. "Not the exact words, but the meaning. Yes, she's been trying to prepare me for something. Something that requires more than just understanding royal protocol or public relations." Margaret closed the diary and looked around the room at all the mysteriously assembled documents. "Your Majesties, I think we need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something that our normal security procedures weren't designed to handle." Charles took his wife's hand and looked directly at Thomas. "Thomas, yesterday Camilla told me that you witnessed some unusual events and handled them with discretion and courage. Right now, I think we need people around us who can accept extraordinary circumstances and still function effectively. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Your Majesty, whatever this is, whatever Queen Elizabeth is trying to communicate, I'm prepared to help you understand it. As if responding to his words, a gentle breeze moved through the room despite all the windows being closed. The papers on the desk rustled softly, and for just a moment everyone present could feel a presence in the room with them. It was warm and protective, like a grandmother watching over her family. She's here, Camilla whispered. She's trying to show us something important. And in that moment, Thomas realized that his role in this mystery was only beginning. 3 days after the mysterious appearance of the crown jewels in the throne room, Thomas found himself in a position he never could have imagined. King Charles had quietly assigned him to a special security detail, with one unusual mission: to monitor and document any supernatural activity within the palace while maintaining absolute secrecy. The decision had come after a private meeting between Charles, Camilla, Margaret Walsh, and Thomas, where they had agreed that conventional security measures were inadequate for their current situation. The media and government officials had been told that the crown jewels incident was the result of a sophisticated but unsuccessful theft attempt, with the artifacts being moved temporarily for enhanced protection. Thomas's new role required him to patrol the palace during the late evening and early morning hours when most staff members were gone, and the building settled into its ancient rhythms. He carried special equipment, cameras designed to capture unusual phenomena, electromagnetic field detectors, and a detailed logbook for recording any incidents. On the third night of this new assignment, Thomas was walking through the portrait gallery when he heard something that made him stop completely. It was the sound of classical music, specifically a waltz, playing softly from somewhere ahead of him. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but completely out of place in the empty corridor. Following the sound, Thomas found himself approaching the ballroom, a magnificent space that had hosted countless royal celebrations over the centuries. The ornate doors were slightly open and golden light spilled out into the hallway. Thomas approached carefully, his hand moving instinctively to his radio, but something made him hesitate before calling for backup. Peering through the gap between the doors, Thomas saw something that took his breath away. The ballroom was filled with figures in elegant evening wear, dancing gracefully to the ethereal music. But these weren't solid people. They were translucent, like living memories made visible in the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. At the center of the ghostly gathering, Thomas could clearly see Queen Elizabeth as she had appeared in her younger years. She was dancing with a tall man in military dress uniform who could only be Prince Philip. Around them swirled dozens of other figures, all moving with the grace and dignity of a bygone era. Thomas pulled out his camera and began recording, though he doubted the equipment would capture what his eyes were seeing. As he watched, Queen Elizabeth seemed to sense his presence. She turned toward the door and smiled, then gestured for him to enter the ballroom. Against all his training and common sense, Thomas pushed open the doors and stepped into the room. The moment he crossed the threshold, the music became clearer and more beautiful. The dancing figures seemed more solid, though he could still see through them to the far walls of the ballroom. Queen Elizabeth approached him, moving with the same regal bearing she had possessed in life. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from very far away, like an echo across decades. "Thomas," she said, and somehow he could hear her clearly despite the dreamlike quality of her voice. "Thank you for protecting Camilla and helping Charles understand. What you are witnessing tonight is important for what is to come." "Your Majesty," Thomas said, surprised that he could speak normally in this supernatural environment. "What is it that you need us to understand?" Queen Elizabeth gestured around the ballroom at the dancing figures. "These are the spirits of all who have served the crown with love and loyalty. They remain connected to this place because their devotion transcends death. But there is a darkness approaching, Thomas, a threat to everything we have built and protected." As she spoke, the dancing figures began to fade slightly, and Thomas could sense urgency in the Queen's manner. "In 2 days' time, there will be an attempt to undermine the monarchy from within. Someone close to the family plans to reveal secrets that could destroy public trust in the institution. But more than that, they plan to use occult practices to sever the spiritual connections that have protected the crown for centuries." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural atmosphere of the room. "Who is planning this, Your Majesty? How can we stop it?" Queen Elizabeth's form began to flicker, as if the energy required to maintain this communication was enormous. The ceremonial blade that Camilla found contains the power to protect against such attacks, but only if it is used by someone who truly understands the sacred nature of duty. The artifacts have been appearing to prepare you all for this moment. Your Majesty, I don't understand, Thomas said desperately as the Queen's image continued to fade. How can a ceremonial weapon protect against political threats? Because this is not merely about politics, Thomas. It is about the ancient compact between the crown and the spiritual forces that have guided Britain through its darkest hours. The blade is a focus for that protection, but it requires someone pure of heart to wield it effectively. The music was growing fainter, and the dancing figures were becoming harder to see. Queen Elizabeth reached out as if to touch Thomas's face, though her ghostly hand passed through him without contact. Tell Camilla that she must trust her instincts completely. Tell Charles that his mother's love will always protect him, but he must be brave enough to act on faith rather than evidence. And Thomas, you must be prepared to do something that will seem impossible. What must I do? Thomas asked, but the Queen's form was already dissolving into the moonlight. When the moment comes, you will know, her voice whispered as the ballroom returned to its normal, empty state. Trust in duty, trust in love, and trust in the power of those who serve with pure hearts. Thomas stood alone in the silent ballroom, wondering if he had just experienced a vivid hallucination or the most important conversation of his life. He checked his camera and found that it had recorded nothing but an empty room, though the electromagnetic detector had registered massive energy fluctuations throughout the encounter. As he made his way back through the palace corridors, Thomas's mind raced with questions. Who could be planning to attack the monarchy from within? What kind of occult practices could threaten spiritual protections? And how could he possibly prepare Charles and Camilla for something he barely understood himself? When he reached his security station, Thomas found an urgent message waiting for him. Margaret Walsh needed to see him immediately in her office. As he hurried through the palace, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Queen Elizabeth's warning was already beginning to come true. Margaret's office was dimly lit, and she looked exhausted when Thomas arrived. "Thomas, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "I've been monitoring communications within the palace, and I've detected some unusual activity. Someone has been making unauthorized contact with outside parties, specifically with journalists and what appear to be practitioners of alternative religious practices." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "Do you know who it is?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "The communications are coming from within the royal family's inner circle. Someone with high-level access has been sharing sensitive information and apparently seeking guidance about conducting some kind of ritual or ceremony." "When?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The planned meeting is set for tomorrow night," Margaret replied. "And Thomas, based on the intercepted messages, I believe they intend to use some of the historical artifacts that have been mysteriously appearing around the palace." Thomas realized that Queen Elizabeth's supernatural warning had just been confirmed by very real intelligence. The threat she had described was not only genuine but imminent. Now he had to find a way to protect the royal family and the monarchy itself, using nothing but his loyalty, his courage, and a ceremonial blade that somehow contained ancient protective powers. The final confrontation came on a stormy Friday evening, when most of the palace staff had gone home for the weekend. Thomas had spent the day coordinating with Margaret Walsh to identify the source of the treacherous communications, while keeping Charles and Camilla informed through carefully arranged private meetings. Their investigation had revealed a shocking truth. Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of Camilla's oldest friends and closest advisors, had been secretly working with a group of individuals who sought to destroy the monarchy through a combination of public scandal and occult practices. The plan was to conduct a ritual using stolen royal artifacts that would supposedly sever the spiritual protections surrounding the crown. At 9 p.m., hidden cameras confirmed that Lady Catherine had indeed entered the palace using her legitimate access credentials. She was accompanied by 3 other individuals who had been smuggled in through a service entrance. The group made their way directly to Queen Elizabeth's former private study, where they began arranging the mysteriously appeared artifacts in a ceremonial pattern. Thomas positioned himself in the corridor outside the study, while Charles and Camilla waited in a nearby room. Margaret Walsh coordinated the operation from the security center, ready to document everything that occurred. They had agreed that conventional law enforcement would be inadequate for this situation, given the supernatural elements involved. Through the partially open door, Thomas could hear Lady Catherine speaking in a language he didn't recognize, while the others chanted responses. The ceremonial blade lay at the center of their arrangement, surrounded by documents and photographs they had brought from outside sources. The goal, according to intercepted communications, was to use the blade to cut the spiritual threads that connected the monarchy to its ancient sources of legitimacy. As the ritual intensified, Thomas began to feel the same strange energy he had experienced when touching the blade days earlier. The air in the corridor seemed to thicken, and he could sense malevolent forces gathering around the conspirators. But there was something else present too, a protective warmth that he recognized as Queen Elizabeth's spiritual presence. Suddenly, the temperature in the hallway dropped dramatically, and Thomas could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. From inside the study came the sound of Lady Catherine crying out in alarm. Thomas pushed the door open to find the group in complete chaos. The artifacts they had arranged were moving on their own, sliding across the floor away from their ritual circle. The ceremonial blade was glowing with a soft, golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and standing in the center of the room, clearly visible to everyone present, was the translucent figure of Queen Elizabeth herself. "Catherine, the Queen's," Spirit said, her voice carrying all the authority and disappointment of a monarch addressing a traitor. "How dare you use my belongings in my home to attack everything I spent my life protecting?" Lady Catherine and her accomplices stood frozen in terror as Queen Elizabeth's spirit moved closer to them. The three strangers began backing toward the door, but found their way blocked by additional ghostly figures. Thomas recognized Prince Philip and several other members of the royal family who had passed away over the years. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine stammered, "you don't understand. The monarchy is an outdated institution. The people deserve to know the truth about how the royal family has maintained its power through superstition and manipulation." Queen Elizabeth's spirit grew brighter and more imposing. "The truth, Catherine, is that the crown has endured because it represents something greater than politics or personal ambition. It represents the continuity of a nation's soul, the connection between past and future, and the sacred duty to serve rather than to be served." Thomas realized this was the moment Queen Elizabeth had prepared him for. He stepped into the room and walked directly to where the ceremonial blade lay glowing on the floor. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, he felt a surge of energy that seemed to connect him to centuries of loyal servants who had protected the crown. "Thomas," Queen Elizabeth's spirit said, turning to him with a smile, "you understand what must be done." Thomas lifted the blade, and its golden glow intensified. He could feel the presence of all the spirits who had gathered to protect the monarchy, and he understood that the weapon was not meant to cause physical harm. Instead, it was a focus for spiritual energy, a tool for severing the dark connections that Lady Catherine's ritual had attempted to create. "I break the bonds of betrayal," Thomas said, the words coming to him as if he had always known them. "I sever the cords of malice that would harm the crown. I call upon the loyalty of all who have served in love and duty to protect what is sacred." As he spoke, the blade's light grew so bright that it filled the entire room. Lady Catherine and her accomplices cried out as dark shadows seemed to separate from their bodies and dissolve in the golden radiance. The malevolent energy that had been building through their ritual was completely dispersed. When the light faded, the conspirators stood looking confused and ashamed, as if waking up from a terrible nightmare. The artifacts had returned to their proper places, and the room felt clean and peaceful once again. Charles and Camilla entered the study, having felt the spiritual battle resolve itself. King Charles looked at his mother's spirit with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Mother. Thank you for protecting us all." Queen Elizabeth turned to Camilla with infinite love and approval. "You are worthy of the crown, my dear. Trust yourself, trust your husband, and trust in the power of duty freely chosen. The monarchy will endure because people like Thomas will always step forward when needed." The Queen's spirit began to fade, but her final words were clear and comforting. "I can rest now, knowing that the crown is protected by those who understand its true meaning. Remember always that love and loyalty are the greatest powers in any realm." As the supernatural presence departed, Lady Catherine and her accomplices were quietly taken into custody. The official story would be that they had attempted to steal royal artifacts and been caught in the act. The deeper truth about spiritual protection and ghostly intervention would remain known only to those who had witnessed it. Thomas carefully placed the ceremonial blade back in its proper location, feeling the weight of responsibility and honor that would stay with him for the rest of his service. He had learned that his duty as a palace guard encompassed far more than he had ever imagined, extending into realms where loyalty and love truly could overcome darkness. In the days that followed, the mysterious appearances of artifacts ceased, and the palace returned to its normal routines. But Thomas knew that he had been forever changed by his experience. He had seen proof that service to something greater than oneself could transcend even death, and that true guardianship meant protecting not just physical safety, but the spiritual foundations of everything worth defending. Camilla never again experienced disturbing dreams or supernatural visitations. Instead, she found herself filled with a confidence and sense of purpose that made her one of the most beloved royal consorts in British history. And sometimes, late at night when Thomas walked his patrol routes through the ancient corridors, he could feel Queen Elizabeth's presence watching over them all, peaceful and satisfied that her final mission had been completed successfully.